"We need to cut dead weight," my father-in-law said at the board meeting, pointing directly at me. "You're gone. Pack your trash and get out." My wife, Melissa, sitting beside him in her perfectly pressed navy suit, didn't even look at me when she added, "And I want a divorce. You deserve nothing." They gave me an hour to leave the building I'd helped design, the building where my demolition company had its headquarters for 8 years, the building where I'd hung my first business license and shook hands on million-dollar contracts. Richard Sterling, that's my soon-to-be ex-father-in-law, sat at the head of that polished mahogany table like some corporate king, his silver hair slicked back, his $60,000 watch catching the afternoon light. Around him sat his lackeys, board members who'd smiled at my Christmas parties and complimented my wife's cooking. Now they wouldn't meet my eyes. "Derek," Richard continued, his voice carrying that condescending tone I'd heard at every family dinner for 10 years. "Your services are no longer required. Security will escort you out." I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, letting it all sink in. The betrayal, the calculated coldness, the fact that my own wife had orchestrated this whole thing without even having the decency to tell me herself. "You know what, Richard?" I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "You're absolutely right about cutting dead weight." I walked out of that room with my head up, but inside, something was already changing. Something dark and patient and hungry for payback. The next day, their phones started buzzing. 88 calls before I even left the parking lot of what used to be my company headquarters. Because sometimes when people think they're burying you, they forget you know where all the bodies are buried too. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. My name is Derek Thompson, and until yesterday, I thought I had it all figured out. I ran Sterling Thompson Demolition. Yeah, that's right. Named after my wife's family because apparently I was stupid enough to think marriage meant partnership. We handled the big jobs in Greater Portland: old factories, condemned buildings, commercial teardowns that required real skill and balls-to-the-wall precision. I started with nothing but a pickup truck and a sledgehammer 12 years ago. Worked construction since I was 16, saved every penny, learned the business from the ground up. When I married Melissa, her father graciously agreed to invest in my company. What I didn't realize was that his investment came with invisible strings attached, strings that could be yanked whenever he felt like it. Melissa Sterling Thompson, that's what she called herself professionally, keeping her maiden name hyphenated like some kind of insurance policy. She was everything I wasn't. Ivy League educated, corporate lawyer, old New England money flowing through her veins like antifreeze. When we met at that charity auction 8 years ago, I thought I'd hit the lottery. Beautiful, smart, sophisticated. She made me feel like I could belong in her world. What a joke that turned out to be. The signs were there, of course. They always are. The way she'd correct my grammar at dinner parties. How she'd introduce me as my husband who owns a demolition company instead of just my husband. The little comments about upgrading my wardrobe, my truck, my everything. I told myself it was love, that she was trying to help me improve. But the real sign I should have paid attention to? The way she talked about cutting ties with people who weren't useful anymore. I heard her do it to old friends, former colleagues, even distant relatives. Melissa had this surgical precision when it came to removing people from her life. No emotion, no sentimentality, just cold calculation about who served her purposes and who didn't. I just never thought I'd end up on the chopping block. The morning after the board meeting, I sat in my truck outside what used to be my office building, watching the sun come up over the construction yard where my equipment was parked. Equipment I'd bought and paid for, but which was now somehow tied up in company assets, according to the papers Melissa's law firm had served me with at 6 a.m. That's when I made the first call. "Danny's Concrete Supply, this is Danny." "Danny, it's Derek Thompson." "Derek, hey man, how's business?" "Well, that depends. You still owe Sterling Thompson about 15 grand for that hospital job last month, right?" "Yeah, but payment's not due until—" "I need you to pay it today. Direct deposit to my personal account. The company account's been frozen." There was silence on the other end. Danny Kowalski had been in construction longer than me, and he knew trouble when he heard it. "Derek, what's going on?" "Let's just say I'm liquidating some assets before my business partners do it for me. Can you handle that wire transfer this morning?" "Sure thing, buddy. You okay?" "I'm about to be a lot better than okay." That was call number 1. By the time I finished my coffee, I'd made 87 more. Suppliers, subcontractors, clients who owed money to Sterling Thompson Demolition. I explained the situation in simple terms. Pay me directly, right now, or deal with Richard Sterling's lawyers in 6 months when they finally sorted out the corporate mess. Every single one of them chose to pay me. By noon, I had nearly $200,000 in my personal checking account, money that was legally mine as payments for work I'd already completed. Richard's lawyers would have a field day trying to claw it back, but possession is 9/10 of the law, and I possessed it. The phone calls weren't just about money, though. They were about information. Because when you've been in construction for 15 years in a town this size, you know everybody's business, and everybody knows yours. "Hey, Derek, sorry to hear about you and Melissa," said Tony Ritchie from Ritchie Brothers Plumbing. "My wife saw her at lunch yesterday with some guy from her firm. Looked pretty cozy, if you know what I mean." I knew what he meant. Blake Morrison, senior partner at Whitmore, Sterling and Associates. Harvard Law, father's money. The kind of guy who wore $1,000 suits and drove a Tesla because he thought it made him look environmentally conscious. I'd met him at firm parties, listened to him drone on about sailing and wine collecting. He was everything Melissa thought she deserved and everything I apparently wasn't. "How long's that been going on?" I asked Tony. "Hell, Derek, I don't know. My wife's got a better memory for gossip than me, but she said they looked awful comfortable for coworkers, you know?" After I hung up with Tony, I sat in my truck for a long time, thinking. The rage was there, burning in my chest like heartburn, but underneath it was something colder and more useful. Calculation. Melissa had played this smart, cutting me out legally and financially while setting herself up with a replacement. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. See, Melissa grew up in a world where problems got solved with lawyers and money and social pressure. She'd never had to fight dirty, never had to scrap for everything she had. She thought all she needed to do was flip a switch and I'd disappear quietly, probably slink back to whatever blue-collar hole she figured I'd crawled out of. But I didn't crawl out of any hole. I built everything I had with my own hands, and I wasn't about to let some prep school princess take it away without a fight. The first stop was Sasha's place. Murphy's Tavern sat on the corner of Commercial and Exchange, the kind of neighborhood bar that catered to construction workers, longshoremen, and other people who worked with their hands for a living. Sasha Murphy had bought it 3 years ago after her divorce, turning it from a dive into something approaching respectable while still keeping the blue-collar soul that made it feel like home. Sasha and I had history. We dated for about 6 months before I met Melissa, and we'd stayed friends after I got married, despite Melissa's obvious disapproval. She was the kind of woman who could drink you under the table, fix a busted tap with a paperclip, and make you laugh until your ribs hurt, all in the same evening. Looking back, I probably should have married her instead. "Well, well," she said when I walked in at 3 in the afternoon. "If it isn't the talk of the town." The bar was mostly empty except for a couple of regulars nursing beers and watching a Red Sox game on the big screen. Sasha was behind the bar, her red hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a Murphy's Tavern t-shirt that had seen better days. "News travels fast," I said, taking a seat at the bar. "Honey, in this town, news travels faster than herpes at a frat party." She poured me a beer without asking what I wanted. "So, what's the real story? Because the version I heard from Janet Collins, who heard it from her husband who works at the bank, makes it sound like you got caught stealing or something." "Janet Collins," I said, taking a sip of beer. "Isn't her husband one of Richard's golf buddies?" "Probably. You know how this place works. Everyone's connected to everyone else through about 3 degrees of separation." Sasha leaned against the bar, studying my face. "So, what really happened?" I told her everything. The board meeting, the divorce papers, Melissa's affair with Blake, the phone calls I'd made that morning. Sasha listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making little sounds of disgust. "That manipulative bitch," she said when I finished. "I never liked her, you know that. Too cold, too calculating, like she was always figuring out your net worth when she talked to you." "Yeah, well, turns out my net worth wasn't high enough to keep her interested. Or maybe she found someone with a higher net worth." Sasha pulled out her phone and started scrolling. "You know what? Let me make a few calls. I've got friends all over town, and some of them work in places where people like Melissa and her boyfriend might not realize the help has ears." That's how I learned that Melissa's affair with Blake had been going on for over a year, that they'd been seen together at restaurants in Boston where they thought nobody would recognize them, that Blake had been bragging to his buddies at the country club about upgrading from his current situation, which apparently meant his wife of 15 years and 2 kids. But the real bombshell came from Rosa, who cleaned offices at Whitmore, Sterling, and Associates 3 nights a week. "She tell Rosa about pregnancy test last month," Sasha said, relaying the conversation she'd just had. Rosa, she cleaning the trash, finds the box. But here's the thing. Rosa says Melissa was laughing about it on the phone, saying something about insurance policies and backup plans. The pieces started clicking together in my head. Melissa hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been planning this whole thing, setting up her exit strategy while making sure she got maximum benefit from the divorce. The pregnancy scare was probably just another manipulation, another way to keep Blake interested or maybe create complications in the divorce proceedings. "I need to see Blake," I said. "Derek, that's a bad idea. You're not thinking straight right now." "I'm thinking straighter than I have in years." I finished my beer and stood up. "Where does he live?" Sasha sighed and pulled out a pen and napkin. "Promise me you won't do anything stupid." "Define stupid." "Anything that involves jail time or hospital visits." I took the napkin with Blake's address written on it. "Can't promise that, but I can promise it'll be worth watching." Blake Morrison lived in a glass and steel condo building in the Arts District, the kind of place that screamed, "I make too much money and have no taste." His Tesla was parked in the building's garage, sleek and silver and practically begging to be ducked with. I'd brought a few tools from my truck. Nothing fancy, a tire gauge, a small knife, and a can of spray paint I'd picked up at the hardware store. I also had a baseball bat, but that was more for psychological effect than actual use. The thing about expensive cars is that they're designed to look good and perform well. But they're not built to withstand the kind of abuse that comes naturally to someone who's spent his life working with heavy machinery. A small cut in the sidewall of each tire, and that $70,000 car wasn't going anywhere. The spray paint bright orange, the same color we used to mark demolition sites, spelled out "Home Wrecker" in neat block letters across the driver's side door. I was back in my truck and 2 blocks away before anyone noticed the damage. But I wasn't done yet. The next morning, Blake's vandalized car was the talk of Portland's legal community. Someone had taken a photo and posted it on social media, and it was making the rounds faster than a cat video. By the time Blake figured out how to get it towed and repaired, half the lawyers in the city had seen it. But Blake wasn't the type to take something like that lying down. That became clear when I got a visit from 2 of his buddies at the construction site where I was picking up some equipment I'd left there. Derek Thompson? The first guy was tall and lean, wearing an expensive suit that looked ridiculous at a demolition site. His partner was shorter and stockier, built like a former high school football player who'd discovered protein supplements. "Depends who's asking." "We're friends of Blake Morrison's. We heard you had some kind of misunderstanding with his car." I kept loading tools into my truck, not bothering to look at them. "Don't know what you're talking about." "See, that's funny," the tall one said. "Because Blake seems to think you might be holding a grudge about some personal business." "Blake Morrison can think whatever he wants. Doesn't make it true." The stocky one stepped closer, trying to look intimidating. "Maybe we need to have a more serious conversation about this." That's when I turned around, holding a 2-foot pipe wrench in my right hand. Not threatening them with it, just holding it naturally, the way you hold a tool when you're working. "You know what?" I said, looking both of them in the eyes. "I think we should have that conversation. But first, let me ask you something. Do either of you know what happens when a wrecking ball hits a building that's not properly supported?" They both looked confused. "It doesn't just knock down the building," I continued. "It brings down everything connected to it. All the supports, all the framework, everything that was holding the whole structure together. One impact and the whole thing comes crashing down." I set the pipe wrench down on the tailgate of my truck, but kept my hand near it. "Now you boys can go back to Blake and tell him that Derek Thompson is a reasonable man. I'm willing to call it even on the car situation, assuming he's willing to keep his hands off things that don't belong to him. But if he wants to escalate this, if he wants to send more friends around to have conversations, he should probably think real hard about whether he's ready for that wrecking ball to swing his way." The tall one started to say something, but his partner grabbed his arm and shook his head. They walked back to their BMW without another word. That afternoon, I got a call from Melissa. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she said without even saying hello. I could ask you the same question, but I think I already know the answer. "Derek, you need to stop this childish behavior right now. Vandalizing Blake's car, threatening his friends. You're just making everything worse for yourself." "Worse for myself?" "Melissa, sweetheart, you divorced me yesterday and kicked me out of my own company. How exactly could it get worse?" "The restraining order I'm about to file would be a good start. Stay away from Blake, stay away from me, and stay away from anyone connected to our firm. Your firm, you mean? I was never really part of it, was I? Just a useful idiot with a demolition company you could exploit until you found something better. There was silence on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice had that lawyer tone she used when she was trying to sound reasonable while screwing someone over. Derek, I know you're hurt, but we both know this marriage wasn't working. We want different things. We come from different backgrounds. We come from different tax brackets, you mean? That's not fair. You know what's not fair? Finding out your wife's been ducking her coworker for over a year while planning to steal your business. That's not fair. But you want to know what's really not fair, Melissa? What? You actually thought I was stupid enough not to fight back. I hung up before she could respond. The restraining order came through 2 days later, delivered by a very apologetic deputy sheriff who'd actually worked security on a couple of my job sites. It was pretty standard stuff. Stay 500 feet away from Melissa, Blake, their offices, their homes, their known associates, blah, blah, blah. The kind of legal document that sounds scary but is actually pretty toothless unless you do something stupid like show up at their house with a baseball bat, which I had no intention of doing. I had better ideas. The thing about people like Melissa and Blake is that their entire lives are built on reputation and connections. They exist in a social ecosystem where image matters more than substance, where the right connections can make or break your career. They'd use that ecosystem against me, turning my friends and business partners against me with whisper campaigns and legal threats. But ecosystems work both ways, and I was about to introduce some invasive species. The first target was the Whitmore, Sterling, and Associates annual charity auction, held every year at the Portland Harbor Hotel to raise money for some cause that made rich people feel good about themselves while they wrote tax-deductible checks. Melissa had been organizing it for 3 years, and it was supposed to be her showcase event, a chance to demonstrate her social connections and organizational skills to the senior partners. I'd been to the auction every year since we got married, smiling and making small talk while Melissa worked the room. I knew how it operated, who the big donors were, what kind of evening they expected. Most importantly, I knew that the event's success depended on everything going smoothly and everyone staying comfortable and dignified. So naturally, I decided to make it as uncomfortable and undignified as possible. The auction was scheduled for Saturday night. On Saturday afternoon, I put on my best suit, the one Melissa had bought me for these kinds of events, and drove to the hotel. I looked respectable, familiar, like someone who belonged there, the kind of person the staff would recognize but not question. I walked into the ballroom where they were setting up, carrying a clipboard, and wearing the kind of confident expression that says, "I'm supposed to be here." Event staff were arranging tables, setting up auction displays, testing the sound system. Nobody paid attention to one more guy in a suit checking things off a list. The auction items were displayed on tables around the perimeter of the room, everything from vacation packages to artwork to dinner with local celebrities. Each item had a description card and a sign-up sheet for the silent auction portion of the evening. I made a few strategic edits. The romantic weekend in Bar Harbor became romantic weekend in Bar Harbor. Clothing optional, bring your own spouse. The private wine tasting with sommelier became private wine tasting with sommelier. BYOB, sommelier may be intoxicated. Small changes, but the kind that would cause confusion and embarrassment when people started reading them closely. But that was just the warm-up. The real show would start when the guests arrived. At 7 o'clock, I positioned myself across the street from the hotel entrance, sitting in my truck with a clear view of the valet station. The beautiful people started arriving right on schedule. Lawyers, bankers, real estate developers, all of them dressed to the nines and ready to spend other people's money on good causes. Melissa arrived at 7:30, looking stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Blake was with her, playing the role of the devoted boyfriend, his arm around her waist as they posed for the photographer the hotel had hired to document the event. They looked perfect together, rich, attractive, successful, everything a power couple should be. At 8 o'clock, I made my move. I walked into the hotel lobby like I owned the place, nodding to the doorman who recognized me from previous years. The ballroom was packed with Portland's elite, everyone drinking champagne and bidding on vacation packages they didn't need. I grabbed a drink from the bar and started circulating, making conversation with people I'd met at previous events. Everyone was polite but slightly confused about why I was there, given what they'd heard about the divorce and the restraining order, but nobody wanted to make a scene at a charity event. Derek, It was Janet Collins, the banker's wife who'd been spreading gossip about me. I didn't expect to see you here tonight. Wouldn't miss it, I said, smiling. This is always such a wonderful event. Melissa's done such a great job organizing it. Yes, she has, Janet said, clearly unsure how to handle this conversation. Although, I continued, I have to say, some of the auction items this year are a little more adventurous than usual. Have you seen the wine tasting description? Janet looked confused and excused herself to check the auction tables. Within 10 minutes, there was a small crowd around the wine tasting display, and I could hear uncomfortable laughter and whispered conversations. But I was just getting started. I worked my way through the room, having similar conversations with different people. Casual comments about the interesting auction items. Observations about how bold some of the descriptions were. Questions about whether this was intentional or some kind of printing error. By 8:30, there was a low-level buzz of confusion and embarrassment running through the room. People were checking and double-checking the auction descriptions, pointing out the problems to each other, looking around for someone from the law firm to explain what was happening. That's when Melissa noticed me. I was standing near the silent auction table, examining a private sailing lesson that had somehow become a private sailing lesson. Swimwear optional, captain not responsible for seasickness or inappropriate behavior. When I felt her hand on my arm. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her lawyer smile firmly in place for the benefit of anyone watching. "Supporting a good cause," I said loudly enough for the people nearby to hear. "This is for the children's hospital, right? I've always believed in supporting sick children." "You're violating the restraining order." "Actually, I'm not. The restraining order says I can't come within 500 feet of you. It doesn't say anything about public events where you happen to be present. Besides, I was here first." Melissa's smile got tighter. "Derek, you need to leave. Now." "Why? Am I embarrassing you?" I gestured toward the auction table. "I have to say, whoever wrote these descriptions really captured the spirit of the evening. Very honest, very direct. I especially like the one about the romantic dinner being subject to availability of spouse and/or significant other." A small crowd was gathering around us, pretending to look at auction items while obviously listening to our conversation. Melissa realized that making a bigger scene would only make things worse. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "Enjoy yourself. But if you cause any problems..." "Problems?" "Melissa, I'm just here to support charity. Although I do have to ask, who's your date tonight?" "I don't think we've been properly introduced." That's when Blake appeared at her side. Having noticed the commotion from across the room, he looked exactly like what he was, a rich, privileged asshole who was used to getting his way through intimidation and lawyers. "You need to leave," he said, stepping close enough that I could smell his cologne. "Right now." "Blake Morrison, right?" I held out my hand like I wanted to shake his. "Derek Thompson, I think you know my wife." Blake ignored my outstretched hand. "Your ex-wife. And if you don't leave immediately, I'm calling security." "Security?" I looked around the room, noting that our conversation was now attracting serious attention. "At a charity auction?" "Blake, that seems a little extreme. I'm just here to support sick children. Aren't you here to support sick children?" "You know why I'm here." "Actually, I'm not sure I do." "Are you here as Melissa's date? Her lawyer? Her business partner?" I paused, looking back and forth between them. "Or are you here in some other capacity?" The crowd around us was getting bigger, and I could see people starting to pull out their phones. In about 30 seconds, this whole conversation was going to be on social media. Blake realized it too. "We're done here," he said, taking Melissa's arm. "Actually, we're not," I said, raising my voice just enough to make sure everyone could hear me clearly. "Because I think there's something these good people should know about the woman who organized this lovely event." "Derek, don't," Melissa said, her composure finally cracking. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, turning to address the crowd that had gathered around us. "I'd like to take a moment to thank my my ex-wife, Melissa Sterling Thompson, for all her hard work organizing tonight's event. And I'd especially like to thank her boyfriend, Blake Morrison, for his support during this difficult transition period." The crowd went dead silent. Camera phones were definitely out now, recording everything. "You see," I continued, "some of you might have heard that Melissa and I are getting divorced. What you might not have heard is why. It turns out that when you're married to someone who values social climbing over marriage vows, eventually you find yourself being, how did you put it, honey? Cut loose like dead weight." "Derek, stop this right now," Melissa said, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. But here's the thing about dead weight, I said, looking directly at her. Sometimes it's not actually dead. Sometimes it's just resting at the bottom, getting ready to drag everything else down with it. Blake stepped forward, his face red with anger. You pathetic piece of crap. You think anyone here cares about your sob story? You think anyone gives a damn about some blue-collar loser whose wife upgraded? The crowd gasped. Even at a gathering of lawyers and bankers, Blake's comment was way over the line. But it was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Upgraded? I said, looking around at all the faces staring at us. Is that what you call it when a married woman starts ducking her coworker? An upgrade? That did it. The genteel charity auction atmosphere exploded into chaos. People were shouting, cameras were flashing, and Blake was lunging toward me with murder in his eyes. I sidestepped his charge and watched him stumble into the silent auction table, knocking over several displays and sending a champagne fountain crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass and Blake's furious cursing echoed through the ballroom as he tried to get back to his feet, his expensive suit now soaked with champagne and covered in auction brochures. Oops, I said, making sure my voice carried over the noise. Looks like someone had a little too much to drink. Security finally arrived. 2 hotel employees who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than in the middle of this mess. But by then, it was too late to contain the damage. The video of Blake Morrison, senior partner at one of Portland's most prestigious law firms, stumbling drunk into a charity auction display while screaming obscenities, was already being uploaded to every social media platform in existence. I walked out of the ballroom with my head held high, leaving behind a room full of shocked faces and 2 very important people whose carefully constructed public images had just been destroyed in front of half of Portland's power structure. The next morning, the story was everywhere: local news, social media, even a mention in the Portland Press-Herald Society column. The headlines ranged from "Charity Auction Turns Ugly" to "Lawyer Love Triangle Explodes at Harbor Hotel." But my personal favorite was from a local blogger: "When keeping it real goes wrong, rich people behaving badly." Blake Morrison's law firm issued a statement about personal matters not reflecting professional conduct and announced that he was taking a leave of absence. Melissa's name was mentioned in every story, usually with helpful context about the divorce and the affair. Their perfect little world was crumbling in real time, and I had front row seats. But I wasn't done yet, not even close. The next phase of my revenge campaign required more finesse and a lot more patience. I needed to hit them where it really hurt: their money, their reputation, and their future prospects. The charity auction had been public humiliation. What came next would be systematic destruction. I started with Blake's wife, Jennifer. She'd been notably absent from the charity auction, and according to Sasha's network of gossips, she'd been having problems with Blake for months. A little digging revealed that Jennifer Morrison came from money-serious old Boston money, and that a significant portion of Blake's lifestyle was actually funded by his wife's trust fund. I found her at the coffee shop she frequented every Tuesday morning, sitting alone at a corner table, reading what looked like legal documents. She was an attractive woman in her early 40s, well-dressed, but with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been dealing with more stress than her yoga instructor could handle. "Jennifer Morrison?" I said, approaching her table. She looked up, confused. "Do I know you?" "Derek Thompson. I think you might have heard my name recently." Her expression changed immediately. "Oh, you're the husband. Ex-husband, technically. Mind if I sit down? I think we might have some things to discuss." She hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I suppose you want to gloat about what happened at the auction?" "Actually, no, I want to apologize." That caught her off guard. "Apologize? You didn't deserve to be humiliated like that. Your husband's affair isn't your fault, and you shouldn't have to deal with the fallout from my very public meltdown." I paused, letting that sink in. "But I also think you deserve to know the truth about what's been going on." Jennifer stared at me for a long moment, then closed the legal documents she'd been reading. "What truth would that be? How long has this been going on, Jennifer? The affair, I mean." "According to the divorce papers Blake filed yesterday, it started after we separated 6 months ago." Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. "According to other sources, it's been going on for over a year. Other sources are right. I have witnesses who can place them together as far back as 18 months ago. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, travel records." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared and slid it across the table. "Blake's been using the firm's expense account to fund their little romance. Dinners, weekend trips, even jewelry, All of it technically business expenses. Jennifer opened the folder and started reading. Her face went very still, very cold. Where did you get this? Let's just say that when you've been in business for 15 years, you develop certain relationships with people who have access to information. That wasn't entirely true. Most of it had come from Sasha's network of bartenders, cleaning staff, and hotel workers who saw everything but were usually invisible to people like Blake. But Jennifer didn't need to know that. Why are you showing me this? Because Blake Morrison destroyed my marriage and stole my business. But he also destroyed your marriage and spent your money doing it. I figure that makes us allies. Jennifer closed the folder and looked at me carefully. What exactly are you proposing? Blake's about to find out that divorcing a woman with a good lawyer and her own money is a lot more expensive than he thinks, especially when that woman has documentation of financial misconduct and adultery. I leaned forward. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal or unethical. I'm just asking you to make sure your divorce attorney has all the relevant information. And what do you get out of this? The satisfaction of watching Blake Morrison learn that actions have consequences. I stood up. Think about it, Jennifer, but don't think too long. Blake's already started moving assets around, trying to hide money before the divorce proceedings really get started. I left her sitting there with the folder, but I knew she'd use the information. Women like Jennifer Morrison didn't get rich by being stupid, and they didn't stay rich by letting people steal from them. 2 weeks later, Blake Morrison's personal and professional life imploded simultaneously. The Maine State Bar launched an investigation into his use of firm resources for personal expenses. His wife's divorce attorney filed motions for emergency asset freezing and demanded a full forensic accounting of all firm finances. And someone, I have no idea who, leaked the story to a reporter at the Portland Phoenix who specialized in exposing corruption among the city's elite. The headline was brutal. Local lawyer accused of funding affair with firm money. The story detailed Blake's relationship with Melissa, the misuse of company resources, and the growing scandal surrounding their very public behavior. It mentioned the charity auction incident, complete with links to the viral video of Blake's meltdown. But the real kicker was the sidebar story about the other woman, a profile of Melissa Sterling Thompson that painted her as a calculating homewrecker who'd seduced a married man and convinced him to help destroy her husband's business. The article included interviews with several unnamed sources who described Melissa as ruthlessly ambitious and willing to do anything to advance her career. Reading that story over coffee at Murphy's Tavern, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine happiness. You look pleased with yourself, Sasha said, refilling my cup. Just reading the paper. Amazing what passes for news these days. Uh-huh. She sat down across from me. Derek, you need to be careful. You've made your point. You've gotten your revenge. But if you keep pushing, someone's going to push back harder. Let them push back. I'm not the one with anything to lose anymore. That's exactly what worries me. People with nothing to lose do stupid things. Sasha, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not doing anything stupid. I'm just making sure the truth comes out. She looked skeptical, but before she could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Derek Thompson. Mr. Thompson, this is Patricia Henley from Channel 8 News. I'm working on a follow-up story about the Morrison scandal, and I was hoping to get your perspective on recent developments. I stepped outside to take the call, leaving Sasha shaking her head behind the bar. What kind of perspective are you looking for? Well, you were at the center of the charity auction incident, and now your ex-wife is facing some serious professional consequences. Our viewers would be interested in hearing your side of the story. What professional consequences? You haven't heard? Whitmore, Sterling & Associates announced this morning that Melissa Sterling Thompson is being placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. Apparently, there are questions about her role in the Blake Morrison situation and whether she violated any ethical guidelines. I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost physical. Melissa's career, the thing she'd valued more than our marriage, more than honesty, more than basic human decency, was finally crumbling around her. I don't think I have anything to say to the press, I told the reporter. But I will say this. Sometimes people make choices, and sometimes those choices have consequences they didn't expect. After I hung up, I stood outside Murphy's for a few minutes, letting the news sink in. Melissa was losing her job. Blake was facing professional ruin and financial disaster. Their perfect little world was collapsing exactly the way they'd tried to collapse mine. But as Sasha had warned me, People with nothing left to lose sometimes do desperate things. I found that out the next evening when I got home to my apartment, a modest one-bedroom place I'd rented after being kicked out of the house Melissa and I had shared. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was clean and quiet, and nobody could take it away from me. The door had been jimmied open. I knew immediately that this wasn't a random break-in. Nothing was missing. My TV, laptop, and other valuables were all untouched. But someone had gone through my apartment systematically, searching for something specific. Drawers had been opened and carefully closed. Papers had been moved and restacked. Even my computer had been turned on, though whoever did it had been smart enough to shut it down again. They were looking for evidence, documentation that could tie me to Blake's professional problems or Melissa's career implosion. They wanted something they could use to destroy me the way I'd destroyed them. Unfortunately for them, I'd learned a long time ago not to keep important information in obvious places. I made a quick phone call to Danny Kowalski, who owed me several favors and had connections throughout the city's construction industry. Danny, I need a favor. You know anyone who does security work? The kind of person who might be able to tell me who's been asking questions about me around town? Maybe. What kind of questions? The kind that might involve breaking into my apartment and going through my stuff. There was a pause. Derek, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? The kind of situation where rich people think they can solve their problems by hiring the right kind of help. Can you make some calls? Yeah, I'll ask around. But Derek, be careful, okay? These aren't the kind of people who play fair. That night, I didn't sleep at my apartment. Instead, I crashed on Sasha's couch, and we spent the evening going over everything that had happened, trying to figure out who might be desperate enough to break into my place. It's got to be Blake, Sasha said. He's facing disbarment, his wife is taking him to the cleaners, and his reputation is shot. He probably figures if he can prove you orchestrated everything, he can shift the blame. Maybe, but Blake's not the type to get his hands dirty with breaking and entering. He'd hire someone. Or maybe it was Melissa. She's losing her job, her boyfriend is toxic, and her perfect little life is falling apart. She might be desperate enough to try anything. We were both wrong. The call came from Danny the next morning while I was having coffee at Murphy's. Derek, you're not going to believe this. The guy asking questions about you, it's not Blake or your ex-wife. It's Richard Sterling. That stopped me cold. My ex-father-in-law, why would he? Think about it. His daughter's career is ruined. His law firm is dealing with a major scandal, and his golden boy son-in-law-to-be is facing professional destruction. From his perspective, you're the guy who started this whole mess. I didn't start anything. I just finished it. Yeah, well, apparently Richard Sterling doesn't see it that way. According to my guy, Sterling's been making inquiries about you. Real discreet, real expensive inquiries. The kind that involve private investigators and security consultants. That afternoon, I got confirmation that Danny was right. I was leaving the bank when a man in an expensive suit approached me in the parking lot. Derek Thompson? Depends who's asking. He handed me a business card. Robert Kane, Kane Security Services. I think we should talk. I looked at the card. It was understated, professional, the kind that didn't need to advertise because the people who needed those services already knew who to call. What can I do for you, Mr. Kane? Actually, it's what I can do for you. I think you might be interested to know that someone's paying a lot of money to gather information about your activities over the past few months. And you're telling me this because the person paying me asked for information that goes beyond simple background checks. They want details about your daily routine, your associates, your vulnerabilities, the kind of information that suggests they're planning something more than just a lawsuit. I studied his face. Kane was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that suggested military or law enforcement background. He didn't look like the kind of guy who worked for sleazy clients, which made his presence here even more concerning. What kind of something? The kind that might involve making you disappear from their lives permanently. Not necessarily physically, he added quickly, but socially, professionally, financially. The kind of comprehensive destruction that rich people specialize in when they feel threatened. And you're warning me because? Because I don't like being used to destroy people who were just defending themselves. I've done my research on you, Mr. Thompson. You got screwed over by people who thought they were untouchable, and you fought back. That's not criminal behavior. That's just good sense. Kane reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. These are copies of all the reports I've provided to my client, along with documentation of what they've asked me to investigate next. Consider it a professional courtesy. What do you want in return? Nothing. But I'd suggest you be very careful over the next few weeks. Richard Sterling has resources you can't imagine, and he's not the type to forgive or forget. After Kane left, I sat in my truck reading through the reports he'd given me. They were thorough, professional, and terrifying. Sterling had hired Kane to document every aspect of my life: where I lived, where I ate, who I talked to, what I did with my time. But more disturbing were the supplemental reports about Sasha, Danny, and other people who'd helped me. Sterling wasn't just planning to come after me. He was planning to destroy anyone who'd supported me in my fight against his daughter and Blake. That evening, I called a meeting at Murphy's with everyone who'd helped me over the past few months. Sasha, Danny, Jennifer Morrison, and a few others who'd provided information or support. I laid out everything Kane had told me, showing them the reports that detailed how they'd all been investigated. So basically, Danny said, this rich asshole is planning to destroy all of us because we had the nerve to help you fight back when his daughter screwed you over. That's about the size of it. Well, said Jennifer, that settles it then. Settles what? She smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely happy. Richard Sterling thinks he can intimidate people into submission by threatening their livelihoods, but he's made one crucial mistake. What's that? He's threatening people who have resources of their own. Danny, you've got connections throughout the construction industry. Sasha, you know everyone in the service sector. I've got family money and legal connections that go back generations. She looked around the table. And Derek, you've got something even more valuable. What? You've got nothing left to lose and a very good reason to make sure Richard Sterling learns that some people don't back down when threatened. That's when I realized that what had started as personal revenge had become something bigger. Richard Sterling had turned this into a war, and he'd just made the mistake of attacking my allies. Now, it wasn't just about getting back at Melissa and Blake. It was about making sure that rich, powerful people couldn't destroy ordinary people's lives just because they felt like it. The final phase of my revenge campaign began that night. Over the next 2 weeks, we systematically dismantled Richard Sterling's carefully constructed world. Jennifer used her family connections to pressure the bank that held the mortgage on Sterling's summer house, calling in favors that resulted in an unexpected audit of his loan terms. Danny spread word throughout the construction community that Sterling was difficult to work with and slow to pay, effectively blacklisting him from any future building projects. Sasha's network of service workers suddenly became very inefficient whenever they dealt with Sterling family properties. Deliveries were late, repairs took longer than expected, and reservations at exclusive restaurants became mysteriously unavailable. But the real blow came when I decided to target Sterling's most prized possession, his reputation as a successful businessman. Richard Sterling had built his fortune on real estate development, particularly a series of luxury condo projects that had reshaped Portland's waterfront over the past decade. His company, Sterling Development, was privately held, but had several major investors who trusted Sterling's track record of success. What those investors didn't know was that Sterling's latest project, a $40 million luxury tower called Harborview Estates, was built on a foundation of shortcuts, corner cutting, and code violations that would make any honest building inspector nervous. I knew this because my demolition company had worked on the site preparation for Harborview Estates 3 years ago. We'd raised concerns about soil stability and drainage issues that Sterling had dismissed as unnecessarily expensive. The official reports filed with the city claimed that all engineering issues had been addressed, but I knew that wasn't true. More importantly, I had photographs and soil samples that proved it wasn't true. I'd kept the documentation as insurance, the way any smart contractor does when working with clients who have a reputation for shifting blame when things go wrong. Now that insurance was about to pay off in a big way, the first call went to the city's building inspection department. This is Derek Thompson from Thompson Demolition. I need to report some concerns about structural integrity at the Harborview Estates development. The second call went to the Portland Phoenix reporter who'd broken the Blake Morrison story. I've got documentation of building code violations at a major waterfront development. Violations that could affect the safety of hundreds of residents. The third call went to Channel 8 News. Remember that follow-up story you wanted to do about consequences and choices? I think I've got something your viewers would find very interesting. By the end of the week, Harborview Estates was front-page news. City inspectors had swarmed the building, finding exactly the problems I'd predicted 3 years earlier. The state attorney general's office announced an investigation into Sterling Development's compliance with building codes, and several major investors were demanding answers about why they hadn't been informed of potential structural issues. Richard Sterling's response was swift and predictable. He held a press conference denying all allegations and announcing that he was filing lawsuits against everyone involved in what he called a malicious campaign of lies and harassment. But it was too late. The damage was done, and more importantly, it was spreading. The Harborview Estates scandal led to investigations of Sterling's other properties. Those investigations uncovered a pattern of cost-cutting and corner-cutting that went back years. Investors started pulling out of current projects. Banks began calling in loans. City officials who'd approved Sterling's permits suddenly found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about their oversight responsibilities. Within a month, Sterling Development was facing bankruptcy, and Richard Sterling's reputation as Portland's most successful developer was in ruins. But the best part was still to come. Melissa had been hanging on to her job by a thread, hoping that the scandal surrounding Blake would eventually blow over and she could rebuild her career. But when her father's business empire started collapsing, the law firm decided that the Sterling family had become too much of a liability. She was fired on a Tuesday morning, escorted out of the building by security, her access to firm resources cut off immediately. By Wednesday, she was facing her own investigation by the State Bar Association for her role in helping Blake misuse firm resources. Blake, meanwhile, had lost his law license, his wife, his house, and most of his money. He was living in a studio apartment and working as a paralegal for a personal injury firm that specialized in slip-and-fall cases. Their perfect little world, the world they'd tried to exclude me from, the world they'd thought made them untouchable, had collapsed completely. But I wasn't done yet. Because there was one more person who needed to learn that actions have consequences. I found Richard Sterling at his country club on a Saturday afternoon, sitting alone at the bar, nursing what looked like his fourth or fifth scotch. The man who'd pointed at me in that boardroom and called me dead weight now looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. His hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly when he lifted his glass. "Richard," I said, taking the seat next to him. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and furious. Me. You destroyed everything, my business, my daughter's career, everything I built." "No, Richard. You destroyed everything. I just made sure everyone knew about it." "You think you're so clever, don't you? Some working-class hero fighting back against the rich and powerful? I think I'm a guy who got tired of being pushed around by people who thought they were better than me." I signaled the bartender for a beer. "You know what the funny thing is, Richard? You could have just let me go, kicked me out of the company, divorced me from your daughter, whatever. I probably would have just moved on with my life. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Because you made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "You underestimated me. You thought I was just some blue-collar nobody who'd roll over and play dead when the important people told him to. You thought I didn't have the brains or the balls to fight back." Richard finished his scotch and stared at the empty glass. "So what now? Are you going to gloat? Threaten me? What's your endgame here?" "My endgame?" I finished my beer and stood up. "My endgame was watching you learn that money and connections don't make you untouchable, that there are consequences for treating people like garbage, that sometimes the dead weight you try to cut loose ends up dragging you down with it." I left Richard sitting there at the bar, staring into his empty glass, probably contemplating the ruins of his life. But I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. 3 months later, I was back in business. Not demolition this time. I'd decided that part of my life was over. Instead, I'd used the money I'd saved and the connections I'd made to start a consulting firm that helped small businesses deal with legal and financial pressure from larger competitors. It turned out there was a real market for someone who understood how rich people operated and wasn't afraid to fight dirty when necessary. Sasha had become my business partner, bringing her network of connections and her talent for gathering information. Danny Kowalski had invested in the company, providing both capital and credibility in the construction community. Even Jennifer Morrison had joined as our legal advisor, using her family's connections to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. We called the company Second Chance Consulting, and our motto was simple: when they try to bury you, we help you dig your way out. Business was booming. I was working late in our new office, a modest but respectable space in the Arts District. not far from Blake's old condo building, when I got an unexpected visitor. Melissa walked in around 7 o'clock, looking nothing like the polished lawyer who'd destroyed my life a year earlier. She was thinner, tired, wearing clothes that were nice but not expensive. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she wasn't wearing the kind of makeup that had always made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. "Hello, Derek." "Melissa, this is a surprise. I heard about your new business. Congratulations." "Thank you. What can I do for you?" She sat down in the chair across from my desk, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize for everything that happened. The way I handled the divorce, the business, all of it. I was wrong." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. "Why now?" "Because I've had a lot of time to think about what I did and why I did it, and because I finally understand what I lost." "What did you lose, Melissa?" "A good man who loved me, a real partnership, a life that meant something." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I traded all of that for money and status, and the approval of people who turned their backs on me the moment things got difficult. And? And I was hoping maybe we could talk. Not about getting back together," she added quickly. "I know that's not possible, but maybe about finding some way to move forward without all this anger and hatred." I considered her words carefully. A year ago, I would have given anything to hear her say those things. But now, looking at her sitting there, I felt nothing. No anger, no love, no desire for revenge, just a kind of mild curiosity about why she thought any of this mattered now. "Melissa," I said finally, "a year ago, you looked me in the eye and told me I deserved nothing. You helped your father steal my business and destroy my reputation. You chose your boyfriend over your husband and your career over your marriage." "I know, and I'm sorry." "I'm sure you are. But here's the thing about apologies. They don't undo the damage. They don't give me back the year of my life I spent fighting to survive what you did to me. They don't erase the fact that you showed me exactly who you really are when the chips were down." She started to say something, but I held up my hand. "I'm not angry anymore, Melissa. I'm not interested in punishing you or making you suffer. But I'm also not interested in pretending that sorry fixes everything." I stood up. "You made your choices. I made mine. Now we both get to live with the consequences." She sat there for a moment, then nodded and stood up. "I understand. I wanted you to know that I realized what I did was wrong. I appreciate that, but it doesn't change anything." After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the conversation. A year ago, her apology might have meant something. It might have provided some kind of closure or satisfaction, but now it just felt irrelevant, like getting a refund check for something you'd forgotten you'd bought. The truth was, I'd moved on, not just from Melissa, but from the person I used to be when I was married to her. The man who'd tried so hard to fit into her world, to prove he was worthy of her attention and approval. That man was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and completely comfortable with who he was. I'd learned that when people try to bury you, you have two choices: stay buried, or claw your way out and make sure they never get the chance to do it again. I chose option 2. 6 months later, Richard Sterling was found dead in his study, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the stress of losing everything he'd spent his life building. The obituary in the Portland Press-Herald described him as a visionary developer and pillar of the community, but the comments section told a different story. People remembered the corner cutting, the code violations, the way he'd treated employees and contractors over the years. Blake Morrison had moved to Boston, where he was working as a night shift security guard and living in a studio apartment in Southie. According to Sasha's sources, he'd developed a serious drinking problem and spent most evenings at dive bars, telling anyone who'd listen about how his life had been destroyed by a vindictive ex-husband and a conspiracy of working-class losers. Melissa had left Portland entirely, moving to Seattle, where she was working as a paralegal at a small firm that specialized in family law. She'd kept a low profile, avoiding social media and apparently trying to rebuild her life away from the wreckage of her old one. As for me, Second Chance Consulting had grown into one of Portland's most successful small business advocacy firms. We'd helped dozens of companies fight back against corporate bullying, predatory lending, and other forms of economic intimidation. The work was satisfying in a way that demolition had never been. Instead of tearing things down, we were helping people build them back up. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that rich, powerful people could no longer assume they could destroy ordinary people's lives without consequences. Every time we helped a small business owner fight back against a corporate giant, every time we exposed corruption or abuse of power, we sent the same message I'd sent to Richard Sterling and his family. Some people don't stay buried. On a cold February morning, exactly 2 years after that board meeting where Richard Sterling had called me dead weight, I stood in my office looking out at the city of Portland. The harbor was gray and choppy, seagulls wheeling over the water, ferry boats carrying commuters to and from the islands. It was the same view I'd had from my old office, but everything else had changed. My phone buzzed with a text from Sasha. Client meeting at 3, small restaurant owner being squeezed by developer. Sound familiar? I smiled and typed back, on my way. Another day, another chance to help someone fight back against people who thought they were untouchable. Another opportunity to prove that money and power don't always win. Another reminder that sometimes, when you think you're cutting dead weight, you're actually cutting the rope that's holding you up.